الكرام، أهلا وسهلا بكم من جديد. يسرنا الآن أن ندعو إلى المنصة معالي الدكتور عبد الرحمن الحميدي، مدير عام ورئيس مجلس إدارة صندوق النقد العربي، الذي سيتحدث حول مختلف موضوعات المؤتمر، كما سيتطرق إلى مساعي الصندوق لتطوير أنشطته وبرامجه على صعيد أسواق المال العربية، لا سيما على ضوء التعاون المرتقب بين الصندوق واتحاد هيئات الأوراق المالية العربية. ونظراً لضيق الوقت سيكتفي الدكتور الحميدي بتقديم كلمة مختصرة على أن يتم توزيع الكلمة كاملة عليكم.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، السيدات والسادة، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يسرني أن أتحدث إليكم في المؤتمر الأول لأسواق رأس المال العربية في هذه المدينة المتميزة دبي، الذي ينظمه اتحاد هيئات الأوراق المالية العربية وشركة تومسون رويترز بالتعاون مع هيئة الأوراق المالية والسلع لدولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة وصندوق النقد العربي. أود في البداية أن أغتنم الفرصة لأشكر معالي سلطان بن سعيد المنصوري وزير الاقتصاد ورئيس مجلس إدارة هيئة الأوراق المالية والسلع في دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة على تفضله بافتتاح المؤتمر وكلمته القيمة في هذه المناسبة، والشكر موصول لجميع من شارك في تنظيم هذا المؤتمر. سيداتي والسادة، تشهد أسواق المال العربية فترة مميزة على صعيد الأداء منذ بداية العام الماضي واستمر خلال العام الجاري، فقد استعادت هذه الأسواق ما قيمته 434 مليار دولار من قيمتها السوقية الإجمالية خلال تلك الفترة حتى نهاية سبتمبر 2014، وجاء أداءها مجتمعة هذا العام أفضل من أداء معظم الأسواق الناشئة الأخرى، ليعكس عودة الثقة إلى الأسواق العربية، وهو ما تجسد كما تعلمون في ترقية بعض هذه الأسواق إلى مرتبة الأسواق الناشئة كما تم ذكره هذا الصباح. كما رافق التحسن في الأداء ارتفاعا ملحوظا في الاستثمار المؤسسي والاستثمار الأجنبي في هذه الأسواق، وسجل تدفق الاستثمار الأجنبي صافي شراء بلغ لمجموع البورصات العربية حوالي 6.4 مليار دولار عن الشهور التسعة الأولى من العام الجاري 2014، وهو الأعلى على الإطلاق لمثل هذه الفترة. هذا ولم يقتصر التحسن على أسواق الأسهم، فقد تواصل النمو في إصدار الشركات من السندات والصكوك مع تزايد المصدرين وتطور أنواع وهيكل هذه الأدوات، فقد وصلت القيمة الإجمالية لإصدارات الشركات من السندات والصكوك خلال النصف الأول من هذا العام إلى نحو 22 مليار دولار. السيدات والسادة، يتناول جدول أعمال المؤتمر جوانب بالغة الأهمية في هذه الآونة، ولعل من المناسب التأكيد بداية على أهمية التعاون والتكامل المالي بين الدول العربية، الذي يمثل مطلباً حيوياً للارتقاء بأسواقنا المالية وإضافة المزيد من العمق والسيولة إليها. ولا شك أنها مسؤولية مشتركة لكم كسلطات إشرافية للعمل على اتساق التشريعات وفقاً للمعايير الدولية. واسمحوا لي في هذه المناسبة أن أشيد بجهود أمانة مجلس التعاون لدول الخليج العربية، التي تسعى بالتعاون مع هيئات الأوراق المالية في دول المجلس لتوحيد المعايير بين أسواق المنطقة، بما يسرع من إنشاء سوق مالية خليجية موحدة تكون إن شاء الله نواة سوق مالية عربية في المستقبل. وإلى جانب جهود توحيد التشريعات، فإن التطور في تقنيات المعلومات وأنظمتها بالنسبة لأسواق المال باتت اليوم أكثر طواعية في خدمة ربط الأسواق المالية. وأود أن أشير في هذا السياق إلى أن المصارف المركزية العربية تدرس حالياً إمكانية إنشاء نظام إقليمي لمقاصة وتسوية المدفوعات العربية البينية، ومن شأن التقدم في هذا المشروع أن يعزز من فرص ومقومات نجاح ربط الأسواق المالية العربية. سيدات والسادة، يناقش مؤتمركم ظاهرة المراكز المالية ودورها في الاقتصادات، حيث تعمل بعض دولنا العربية على تطوير مثل هذه المراكز والمدن المالية بالاستناد إلى قواعد قانونية وبنية تحتية تتوافق مع المعايير العالمية. ومع اختلاف الرأي حول أهمية هذه المراكز، إلا أنه لا يمكن أن نغفل ما يمكن أن تساهم به مثل هذه المراكز معاً في الارتقاء بمستوى التشريعات والممارسات، والتي من شأنها أن تنعكس إيجاباً على مستويات الشفافية والكفاءة في أسواقنا المالية. سيدات والسادة، يكتسب موضوع تطوير أسواق السندات المحلية العربية درجة عالية من الأهمية، كما تم ذكره هذا الصباح، انعكاساً لتداعيات الأزمة المالية العالمية، والتي نتج عنها تراجع التدفقات المالية والقروض المصرفية عبر الحدود، وكذلك التعديلات على المبادئ والمعايير الدولية مثل اتفاقية بازل 3 والمتطلبات الجديدة للسيولة. وتلقي الأزمة الضوء على المخاطر المرتبطة بتركز نشاط الإقراض عبر القطاع البنكي، إذ أن مساهمة المؤسسات المالية غير المصرفية وأسواق أدوات الدين في تمويل القطاع الخاص لا تزال أقل من المرجو في منطقتنا. وأود في هذه المناسبة أن أشيد بجهود هيئات الأوراق المالية العربية التي تتجه لوضع تشريعات وقواعد خاصة بالسندات والصكوك. سيدات والسادة، قطعت أسواقنا العربية طريقاً طويلاً وشاقاً على صعيد تطوير التشريعات وإرساء الشفافية والإفصاح وممارسات الحوكمة وتوفير الحماية للمستثمرين. ومع كل ما تحقق، إلا أنها تمثل خطوات يتعين مواصلتها بخطوات أخرى متسارعة في ظل المنافسة الكبيرة بين المناطق لإرساء المزيد من الشفافية وتطبيق ممارسات الحوكمة والرقابة عليها ومتابعتها لتوفير البيئة المشجعة للمستثمر المؤسسي، وهو بالطبع ليس خافياً عليكم كسلطات إشرافية. وعلى الرغم من التحسن النسبي في تعاملات المستثمر المؤسسي في الأسواق العربية في الآونة الأخيرة، إلا أن هناك حاجة للمزيد من الجهود نحو تطوير الاستثمار المؤسسي في الأسواق العربية. فقد بيّنت التجارب أن المستثمر المؤسسي يتجه إلى الأسواق التي تطبق أعلى المعايير والمؤسسات الدولية السليمة. سيدات والسادة، تشهد أسواق التمويل الإسلامي اهتماماً متزايداً على الصعيد العالمي ومن المؤسسات الدولية أيضاً. وفي المنطقة العربية تجاوزت حصيلة تمويل الشركات العربية عبر الإصدارات من الصكوك هذا العام حصيلة التمويل من إصدارات السندات التقليدية ومن التمويل عبر أسواق الأسهم. ويقدر أن يسجل هذا العام رقماً قياسياً على مستوى الإصدارات من الصكوك. ويوفر النمو في التمويل الإسلامي فرصة كبيرة لمنطقتنا العربية لجذب المزيد من المدخرات والاستثمارات إلى أسواقنا المالية، بل تستطيع دولنا العربية أن تأخذ زمام الريادة كمراكز عالمية للتمويل الإسلامي. ويتطلب الوصول لذلك متابعة تطوير التشريعات والقواعد المنظمة مدعومة بالأدوات المناسبة بما يوفر البيئة والبنية التحتية اللازمة. ونشيد في هذه المناسبة بمساعي السلطات في مدينة دبي في هذا الشأن، إدراكاً للفرص والآفاق التي يتيحها هذا التمويل. سيدات والسادة، تعتبر المنطقة العربية من أكثر مناطق العالم ضعفاً بمؤشرات الوصول إلى التمويل والشمول المالي. ولا يخفى عليكم أن تحسين فرص الوصول للخدمات المالية وأسواق المال وخاصة من قبل الشركات الصغيرة والمتوسطة، يمثل تحدياً كبيراً في سبيل تعزيز فرص النمو الشامل في الدول العربية. ولعل من الجوانب المهمة التي تستحق الإشارة هنا موضوع التثقيف والتوعية المالية، وهو جانب على درجة عالية من الأهمية في حالة دولنا العربية. ويمثل التقرير الصادر قبل أيام قليلة حول الموضوع عن المنظمة الدولية لهيئات الأوراق المالية إرشادات مناسبة يتعين النظر فيها من قبل سلطاتنا الإشرافية. وأنتهز هذه المناسبة للإشارة إلى أنه وبمباركة من مجلس محافظي المصارف المركزية ومؤسسات النقد في الدول العربية، تم في العام الماضي إنشاء فريق عمل إقليمي لتعزيز الشمول المالي في الدول العربية. وهناك مؤتمر إقليمي يعتزم صندوق النقد العربي تنظيمه حول التثقيف المالي خلال العام القادم، ونتطلع للتعاون مع هيئات الأوراق المالية العربية في هذا الجهد. السيدات والسادة، يمثل تطوير أسواق رأس المال العربية محوراً رئيسياً من محاور اهتمامات صندوق النقد العربي. وفي هذا السياق فإن الصندوق بصدد إطلاق مجموعة من المبادرات والبرامج في إطار استراتيجيته للسنوات القادمة تستجيب بصورة كبيرة للقضايا والجوانب التي يتناولها مؤتمركم اليوم. وبالطبع يدرك الصندوق أهمية تعزيز التعاون والتواصل مع هيئات الأوراق المالية والبورصات في الدول العربية ومع المتعاملين في هذه الأسواق. ونحن نؤمل أن تساهم مذكرة التفاهم بين الصندوق واتحاد هيئات الأوراق المالية العربية في تعزيز هذا التعاون وإطلاق أنشطة مشتركة مثل هذا النشاط لخدمة الأغراض التي نسعى جميعاً لتحقيقها. سيدات والسادة، في ختام كلمتي أتمنى لهذا المؤتمر كل النجاح في طرح هذه الموضوعات الهامة والاستفادة من تواجد هذا الكم الكبير من الخبرات الرفيعة من وطننا العربي. مجدداً خالص الشكر لاتحاد هيئات الأوراق المالية العربية وهيئة الأوراق المالية والسلع الإماراتية على تعاونهم مع الصندوق. كما أنتهز هذه الفرصة لأتقدم بالشكر والعرفان إلى كافة السلطات والجهات المعنية في دولة مقر صندوق النقد العربي دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة على مساندتها ودعمها المتواصل للصندوق في تحقيق أهدافه. أشكر لكم حضوركم وحسن استماعكم، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
أشكر معالي الدكتور عبد الرحمن الحميدي على كلمته وأدعوه للتفضل بالبقاء معنا، إذ سنكون الآن مع مراسم توقيع مذكرتي تفاهم، الأولى بين اتحاد هيئات الأوراق المالية العربية ممثلا بالسيد حسن بولقنادل ورئيس الاتحاد، وصندوق النقد العربي ممثلا بالدكتور عبد الرحمن الحميدي مدير عام ورئيس مجلس إدارة الصندوق. والمذكرة الثانية بين الهيئة العامة للرقابة المالية المصرية ممثلة بالسيد شريف سامي رئيس مجلس إدارة الهيئة وهيئة الأسواق المالية اللبنانية ممثلة بالسيد سامي صليب المفوض بالتوقيع عن رئيس هيئة الأسواق المالية اللبنانية. فليتفضل السادة الموقعون، كما ندعو السادة رؤساء هيئات الأوراق المالية أو من يمثلهم للتفضل بالمشاركة في مراسم التوقيع.
طبعا بيسعدنا توقيع المذكرة التفاهم، بس اللي بنقوله احنا مش محتاجين توقيع مع كل السادة الموجودين، والدول هي دول صديقة وشقيقة، يعني هو تحصيل حاصل التوقيع. أي شخص بيطلب معلومة أو تبادل خبرة احنا بنستفيد وهم، وأتصور إنه هذه اللقاءات مهمة، يمكن غير اللي بنقوله في القاعة، خارج القاعة وفي الاستراحات، لأنه هذا التواصل هو اللي في الحقيقة بيذلل المصاعب وبيخلينا ننتبه إلى مبادرات جديدة في أسواق تانية بتؤدي بالتدريج إن شاء الله أنه يبقى سوق متكامل ومتفاعل. وأشكركم.
How can MENA financial centers compete internationally? A big question that opens the door to a lot of considerations in terms of opportunities and threats of competing with global financial centers. What should be done to make Arab capital markets really competitive? And what is the role of innovation and ethical standards in this? The speakers in our first debate session have a lot to say on these matters. To start proceedings, I welcome on stage the moderator of this session, Mrs. Ruth Martin, Managing Director of the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investments, and our panel speakers, Mr. Tamer Bazari, Chief Executive Officer, Genero Capital, Mr. Angus Blair, Chairman, Signet LLC, Mr. Nitin Mehta, Managing Director, CFA Institute, and Mr. Faisal Sarkho, Chief Executive Officer, Kipco Asset Management Company.
Of challenge. As with all conferences where you're looking at change and transformation and development, so there is both celebration of what has been achieved and also challenge of what is yet to come. And I think in our session this morning with my esteemed colleagues, we are going to touch on some of the journeys of specific situations and case studies where there has been both celebration and challenge, and we are going to challenge you to consider how the development of competition globally can benefit the MENA area as you try to grow the capital markets. We have heard from our esteemed speakers this morning of the huge sums of money. We have heard about the significance of investor confidence, of transparency, and of disclosure. All of these things are common to those of us who are based in London, as you are, based here in the Middle East and in the MENA area. I'm Ruth Martin, and I think we are now going to be ready to start our session proper. I'm very privileged to be speaking to you this morning on behalf of a body which has very much tried to help boost competition in the MENA region through a very specific area of work, which is through the development of professional standards for market practitioners. And the CISI does this through working closely with regulators to ensure that where regulators are developing new requirements for their markets, that the way in which they attract talent, manage that talent, ensure that that talent is equipped to give of its best, is through matters such as qualifications and professional standards. It's a great honor for me to see His Excellency Mr. Al-Tarifi speak this morning, because here in the UAE, where the CISI has its regional base, it was the Securities and Commodities Authority which hosted our office and offered us hospitality in order to begin our journey in this region. So very delighted to have been able to hear him today. The CISI works with regulators in the region, including the Central Bank in Lebanon, in Kuwait, in Qatar, in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, as well as in Dubai and the UAE, and all around how you both develop people and you mitigate people risk. And that's just one of the key elements of competition that we're going to look at during our session this morning. How we're going to structure our session is I want my colleagues to start by introducing their particular perspective on competition. I've introduced mine by focusing on people risk and people opportunity. I'd like to start actually with asking Tamir to open with his perspective on competition, and he will also say anything more about himself that he feels would help inform the debate. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Ruth. Just kind of a background on myself. I worked between 2000 and 2002 as the senior advisor to the Dubai financial market. Previous to that, I was in consulting, so I worked on the concept of the DFM and worked on kind of the whole establishment of the capital markets, working with ESCA, DFM, ADX, that was established several months after that. So my roots to the capital markets go back to kind of 99-2000 arena. While at DFM, I was called one day to a meeting attended by my boss, then Isa Kazem, and the current governor of the DIFC, with Mr. Mohammed Gargawi and a fourth person. And we sat around a very small table in Mr. Gargawi's office, and the discussion was, we were discussing the idea of setting up a financial center in Dubai that is international, that has all the elements of the best financial centers, and that is very relevant to the region. And we spent about 2.5 hours debating the discussion, and the kind of conclusion of that meeting was to form a committee to look into creating an international financial center in the UAE. The team then went and studied what is the key success factors of an international financial center. We went to Ireland, looked at the model there, and after a 6-month study, our findings were presented to His Highness Sheikh Mohammed, and the DIFC was established. So I'll tell you a little bit more about our experience then, and talk about where I see the competition of regional exchanges are. So we embarked on that journey. We evaluated 32 financial services areas that we felt could be relevant, and came up with 5 that were relevant to the region. The exchange was at the heart of that, to find a transparent, liquid, dynamic exchange, which is the Nasdaq Dubai eventually was created. Unfortunately, the Nasdaq Dubai has gone through a phase where it was established at a time when the markets were quite high. It was hard to get attention to it, and today has been focusing quite a bit on the sukuk and debt issue, which has been very successful on. But as a current member of the Nasdaq Advisory Board, we're always finding ways of how to promote getting liquidity into a market. So it's a chicken and egg story. You want to get good listings to get liquidity, but you need liquidity to get good listings. The DFM experience was one that was a very interesting one. It was the first regulated exchange in the UAE, but because of the fact that there was a lot of gray market and there were a lot of public companies already in the UAE, the liquidity aspect of it kind of picked up quite a bit. And today, with the inclusion into very large international indices, it shows that these are markets that are on the right path. DIFC as an exchange versus the local exchanges, and a lot of the kind of international exchanges in Abu Dhabi and Qatar and other areas that is establishing itself as a, if you want, hub. These exchanges have to differentiate themselves in certain ways. The regulatory regime has to be very clear. You have to have the regulations that are very reasonable, strict enough to make sure that people are in compliance, but also reasonable enough to kind of make sure that companies list and people find this cost benefit of being listed, to make sense. The enforceability of regulations, I think, is also very, very important, and we've seen certain incidents and certain regulators that have been more strict than others in terms of enforceability. And one thing having good regulation, but something else is to enforce those regulations. So I think that's also a very key reason to have a successful exchange. And human capital. It's very important to have the ability to attract and retain very good people, be it in the regulatory side as well as potential companies that are involved in listed companies, advisors, etc. So to make sure that the standards are quite high, and hence the CFA representation and the CISI representation is very, very relevant within this panel. So just to sum up, I think the potential to create leading exchanges within this region that are able to attract international capital, get liquidity, get a lot of the companies listed is very, very possible, very doable. But I think those elements in terms of particularly the human capital element is very, very important for it. And I see the way things are moving in the region with more exchanges, with more collaboration, trying to create more of a liquidity pool by getting these exchanges together can really create a deep and liquid and quite a large market to get the attention of international investors as well as regional investors, and to have a more vibrant market than the more fragmented markets that we have today.
Thank you. Thank you, Tamir. And Faisal is now going to introduce himself and his particular interest in competition in the region.
Now, just as way of background, myself, I've been working with the capital markets as an advisor, first of all, and today was termed as the Big Four. Used to work in KPMG in the late 90s, and then joined Camco, where I am today the CEO. Now, at Camco, in a nutshell, we manage $14 billion. Our AUM stands at $14 billion. A variety of managed funds, portfolios, etc. We grew the business from 50 million KD in 2000 to reach this level as of the last quarter. Now, in addition to that, we've been focused on investment banking transactions and a lot of activities on the capital markets. We have been leaders in managing IPOs in the Kuwaiti market, debt issuances for corporates. So we've been extensively working with a lot of private sector businesses, public sector businesses, moving them from private to public, and had a great experience seeing the growth of the Kuwaiti market. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of issues. Kuwait maybe is a good example of seeing the evolvence of capital markets, the evolvence of regulation. If you go back to history, Kuwait, having a lot of merchant families, established shareholding entities even in the 50s. So if you look at a bank like MBK, established in the early 50s, you look at Kuwait Airways, established also as a shareholding entity in the 50s. By the 60s, a law was passed to establish, to organize the stock exchange and create more of an official market. This created basically the basis for the Kuwait Stock Exchange. Now, in the 70s, there was an abundance of liquidity. There was a lot of activity in the capital markets in the Kuwaiti side as infrastructure booms happened and the oil revenue was coming in. What was interesting in that phase in the 70s was that you had a crash in the mid to late 70s, a small crash. That resulted in the government putting more regulation on the capital markets, slowing down maybe the activity on the official market. Then you had a creation of an unofficial market, which was the Souk al-Manakh. Now, Souk al-Manakh crashed in 1982. However, at its peak, some might be surprised to hear that it was the third largest market cap in the world after the US and Japan. Now, the crash in 1982 resulted again in government intervention, government bailout. That happened also in the 70s. Now, what's interesting is that since then, with the invasion of Kuwait, post-invasion of Kuwait, the capital market, the stock exchange started to grow, IPOs increased. We reached a stage where even today, more than 25% of listed entities in the GCC are from Kuwait in terms of numbers. In terms of size, maybe 10% of the capital markets, and in terms of liquidity, around 3 to 4%. Now, what's happened is that in the last 15 years, let's say pre-financial crisis, you had a lot of activity in terms of IPO, companies going public. There was not sufficient regulation, in my opinion. And I think that with the introduction of course, the Capital Markets Authority, there was a lot of organization added back to our market. And with that, of course, you have the bedding in period where adjustments need to be made by private players. evolvence of regulation, evolvence of standards within the market, and that, in my opinion, has been a very good move. Hopefully, we see the markets becoming more transparent, companies applying better corporate governance. We are seeing this already in different capacities. So our market is evolving, and I just wanted to highlight it in terms of competitiveness, the move of Qatar and UAE into the emerging status from frontier. Others, Kuwait included, are moving in that direction. So the market is improving, but what we lack, in honesty, is depth and breadth in our markets. So synergy maybe between the different markets in the region in terms of regulation, depth and breadth of products. I mean, today in Kuwait, you have a lot of asset managers who have experience, who have built up funds and structures that have succeeded. Some have failed, some have succeeded, but this is the market at the end of the day. And I think that in Kuwait's standing, we look forward to shifting also our market more, improving the stock exchange, you know, the privatizations that are happening for certain of the exchange itself and other elements. And the CMA has been very active and supportive in growing this market. So you see the evolvence, and I just wanted to maybe put that as a case study and show how our market in Kuwait has grown and moved.
Thank you very much, Faisal. And we next have Angus. Thank you, Angus.
Thank you very much. I started working in investment bank in 1983 in the early days of privatization in the UK. And I don't really want to mention my background. It's a bit embarrassing to do this sort of thing, but it's relevant to what I'm about to say. I was asked after joining a double Extel rated team, and those of you in Thomson Reuters know what that is, in London. I moved in 1993 at Barings onto emerging markets, and in those days, the Middle East, North Africa, I was put in charge of all of Southern Europe and the Middle East, North Africa. And in those days, it was a region where it was easier to raise money for deals in Stockholm and in London and in Edinburgh and Paris and Boston than it was in the region. And I did the first fund to invest in Oman, the Oryx Fund in '94, the first GDR in Egypt in '96, the IB, and the largest country fund in years for Saudi Arabia, the first fund to allow foreigners to invest in Saudi, the SAFE Fund, amongst others, including Solidaire and Audi. And I mention this because, quite frankly, in the last 20 years, the region's moved on in the capital markets, but not really fast enough as they should have, in terms of the competition with the rest of the world and in the region. And it's where now, in my new guise, in my new hat, I try to come up with some solutions. But what is this question we have in front of us today? How do we make this region more competitive? As my good friend Akad Marhoun and I were just discussing, of course, much of this is due to the size of the markets, and global investors particularly, but also regional investors, including sovereign wealth funds, look for size. They're looking for liquidity. They're looking for investable stocks. I'm not talking at the moment, obviously, of debt markets, because that's another issue and shouldn't be divorced from what we're talking about in the markets today and tomorrow. Debt markets are vitally important, providing liquidity for governments usually, as well as private companies. So first of all, its size. But let me give you an example. When I moved to London from Scotland in 1986, there was more trading in German and French equities in London than there was in Frankfurt and Paris. That changed, but it took time to allow the financial centers in Paris and Frankfurt to develop. But it took near enough 10 to 15 years for that to happen. If you look across the Middle East, North Africa, there's still a problem of liquidity, problem of investable stocks. But of course, as we mentioned this morning, as we heard, there's a lot of interest in Saudi Arabia because it's a large liquid market with large number of liquid stocks. That's not really the case in many other markets. So there's a problem here. And if I look at my home market in Egypt, for example, the fact that some very large stocks have delisted to an extent in the last few years some years ago lost Vodafone when Telecom Egypt took it over. The Rascom companies delisting or scaling back London, Cairo, going to Amsterdam in case of OCI. So the attractiveness of Egypt diminished as the liquidity diminished, and I'm not ignoring the politics, but as the liquidity diminished and the investables diminished. So we need more listings of private companies in this region, and we need better governance of those in terms of the regulations, because there are moments when I see the regulatory body over the last 20-odd years where the regulatory body hasn't been present, where it's been too light in the market, and other times where it's been too heavy. So I'd like to see more maturity in the regulatory environment. I think also it's an important point that the financial, the banks and non-bank financial institutions, we need better confidence in those. So I think we need better governance in many of the banks, not all of them. Some of them are quite tremendous. And I think we need to lead on from that, better quality training of human capital. This is pointed out as the slide, as people in the audience pointed to. Human capital development is vital. And I think it's important that people in the industry need better training. But of course, having been at Barings and ABN AMRO in London, you see in the middle of a crisis, people managing financial institutions who are quite frankly out of their depth. And the questioning has to also be led at the top. Are the people who are managing those institutions, are they the right people? And are they being, should they be replaced? And that should be done by central banks, by the regulatory bodies, and by shareholders. But let's be positive about this too. I think that this is a region that can bypass many of the structures of other global markets, because they're all electronic now, as well everyone is, but it's a region of great creativity, and I'd like to see that reflected in the financial services industry. If you actually look at the global investment banks and asset management houses in the last few years in the Gulf, they've scaled back, they've downsized their operations. So basically asset managers, all they're doing is gathering assets. They're not really managing, not many of them, some of them are, but not really managing assets regionally, and I think that's a great shame. I'd like to see more creativity and product development, for example, in this region. And I think we should also rethink what we are. I was working in the markets in the UK when Britain still had another stock market, the Glasgow market. It closed when I was in London. Historically, there were over a dozen stock markets in the UK, and we forget that stock markets acted as a center of liquidity and capital base to allow to finance local companies. And I wonder whether we have to rethink the role of the regional stock markets. It isn't just a case of competition with each other or with global markets, but what is its function? How do we really help to grow companies all over Oman, for example, or all over Jordan, or all over Egypt? We have to rethink what it is. It shouldn't just be one central institution. It's perhaps rethinking its role as to bring capital to where it's required. And in a region where I'm involved in this too, in startups, there's tremendous startup scene in Jordan and in Egypt. The summit that took place in Beirut only a few days ago, tremendous talent that needs to be financed. They shouldn't be going to California or New York for financing. It should be done on a local and regional basis. So I think about how the stock market can manage this, and I like the effort of Egypt to look at the regulation of microfinance. There are many ways in which I think we can be competitive, but I could try to come up with solutions, but that's one of them, and perhaps we can discuss this more in the Q&A session.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Angus. And now I'd like to turn to Nitin. Thank you, Nitin.
Thanks. Thanks, Ruth. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nitin Mehta. I'm the Managing Director for CFA Institute. I used to be a fund manager for 20 years beforehand, working in London, arguably the leading financial center in the world. In case you're not familiar with CFA Institute, it's a not-for-profit global professional association. Perhaps it's best known for the CFA designation and the CFA program. Today we have 120,000 members, of whom 100,000 and more are CFA charter holders. We have 220,000 candidates for the CFA program. And one of the regions that is enjoying the fastest growth in terms of professional designation is in fact here in the Middle East. We have 1,000 members in the Middle East and about 3,000 candidates. Now, in terms of what we do, I'm reminded of a story when I was recently going through Dulles Airport in Washington, and the immigration officer asked me, he said, "What do you guys do at CFA Institute?" And I was a little tired, so I gave my short cocktail party answer. I said, "Well, we try to raise standards of ethics in finance." He slapped down my passport. He said, "Well, try harder." Try much harder. And at first I thought the young man was rude, but then on reflection I decided he was right. What really matters for a financial center, for a financial industry, is that the quality of the practitioners, the participants, and the managers of the financial center really matters. I think if you look at any assessment of financial centers, perhaps the Global Financial Center Index, GFCI, if you're familiar with that, the most important factor cited for competing as a financial center is the quality of the human capital. And we saw that in the survey that Ruth carried out just with that simple question earlier, and a number of my colleagues mentioned that as well. And yet, in the wake of the global financial crisis, it seems that there's been too much of an emphasis on structural reforms. You know, how much capital do banks need, and so on. And perhaps what's been neglected is enough attention to the social reforms. How do we raise the quality of the people working in finance? Let me ask you this, by way of comparison of our industry with another profession. Would any of you go to a doctor if she was not properly qualified, if she was not current in her practice, if she didn't abide by a code of ethics, or if she wasn't licensed to practice? You wouldn't do that, and nor would I. And yet, in finance, right across the board, we have many people who don't have to adhere to the same very high levels of professional standards. I think what's expected of healthcare should be expected of wealth care as well. So how can we achieve all this? I think we need to work together. I think regulators need to demand that finance and investment professionals meet certain minimum standards of the profession. In other words, minimum qualification, some continuing education, and adherence to a code of ethics, and so on. So regulators need to demand that. I think employers should also require their leading employees to gain a professional standing. It would advertise to prospects and existing clients the emphasis that the employer places on professional standards. And finally, as individuals, as practitioners, I think if you're really serious about your career, then you should consider also gaining a professional standard as well. You know, make work much more than just a job that pays the mortgage. All of us need to think of it as a vocation. So raising professional standards, I think, would protect investors, it would help to get more clients, and would help financial centers to compete better as well. So they really matter.
Thank you very much. Now, one of the issues was raised by the first question we asked is where the area of focus, and the top two were people, and Nitin has made some address to that, and the other one was, of course, regulation. Now, the challenge of regulation is that if it's too heavy, it stifles innovation and stifles product development and can stifle creativity. If it's too light, then, of course, the problem is that there's no confidence, or it can diminish confidence. Listening to my colleagues here today, of course, in the UK, where I'm based, the financial crisis exposed the problems of too light regulation in the field of people, because when the collapse has come, and I'm sure those of you that read the financial press will see that there's no shortage, sadly, of scandal where poor conduct has been an issue. And I would personally say that much of that is because back in 2005 to 2007, the regulator tried to introduce principles-based regulation, light touch regulation. And unfortunately, when the crash came, all the recovery issues were clouded by issues of reputation. And so no matter what we do, reputation continues to dog us, certainly in the West. Now, when it comes to regulation here, and we've heard a number of regulators this morning, how do we, colleagues, get that balance right between having sufficient rigor in the regulation that gives confidence to investors and yet is not so heavy that actually it stifles innovation? I just wondered if any of my colleagues on the panel would like to venture an opinion on that. Tamir.
I'll give it a shot. So for my sins, I started my career in auditing in Canada, and you know, what we've learned as we develop within our career is more of what we call risk-based auditing. And I think a lot of what we look at in terms of regulation is really where is the risk. Not focusing on you know, the size and the number of pages of a prospectus or a book, but really what are the key things that the investors need to know. What is the transparency matters, etc. I've been approached, I sat again on the NASDAQ advisory board, and a lot of the parties that have come to us saying, you know, NASDAQ is just overdoing it potentially. They're trying to make sure that, you know, there's just so much information, so much detail, so much rigor that it actually makes it very unappealing for the SME segment, which is the segment I focus on for our business, to actually do the work. When we talk to NASDAQ, obviously, again, we're talking about balance. They're worried that, you know, a bad apple ends up listing, and we do have some, you know, reputational matters. I always say we are in the business of trust. So, you know, we talk about healthcare and wealth care. If parties lose trust of a financial center or of a regulator, it's very, very difficult to get that trust back. So I think what we could do is we could have different tiers of if you want, for the larger companies that have a lot of rigor, having maybe a bit more rigorous and more detailed requirements. But for the smaller ones, again, I think the risk-based way of regulating those companies and making sure that there's enough information and enough, if you want, warning signs available. But I think where these markets are going to grow are going to come from the segment of SMEs. And, you know, we're talking, Angus mentioned, you know, entrepreneurship, etc. I sit on the investment committee of the biggest VC fund in the region, and we just announced today we exited a company which is based on a technology company based in the region out of Lebanon, 2.5 years after investing it for 6 times our money to a Japanese listed public company. So there's a lot happening in the background within ICT in the region, within SME space in the region. We just need to find liquidity avenues for them. We as Genair, we're about to launch with 2 partners an SME mezzanine finance platform. So the idea is to do mezzanine financing for smaller tickets, which the banks are not catering to. In the UAE, 65 billion dirhams is the demand, the qualified demand of SMEs for financing. Actual bank lending is only 30 billion. There's a big unmet demand there. So I think financing, getting SMEs empowered and getting them to really work hard on growing is something that a lot of the growth and potential could come from.
Thank you. And I know, Nitin, you had something to add, yeah?
Yes, you know, Ruth, you mentioned regulation. There's always an inherent and a natural tension around regulation. On the one hand, regulators aim to protect the public interest, and the industry at the same time has the private shareholders to cater for. But at the same time, the industry also looks to serve its clients with new products, innovation, entrepreneurship, and so on. But this tension between serving a public interest and a private interest of shareholders on the part of industry means that the industry often complains bitterly about too much regulation. Having been an industry practitioner for almost 2 decades, it's almost an evergreen situation. And I think following the onset of the financial crisis, I think instead what the 2 sides need to do is to work together. The industry, instead of trying to lobby against regulation, trying to capture regulators and so on, instead should lend their expertise as market participants to the regulators. They should make sure regulators have enough resources as well. That's where the lobbying effort should be. So I think it'd be good if the industry complements the formal regulation rather than plays a tug of war with regulators.
Actually, I was just recalling our speaker from the Lebanon this morning, Capital Markets Authority. He spoke about the significance of consulting the stakeholders with proposed regulation and entering into a real process of listening to those in the market and not simply imposing. And I know that my experience of working with a regulator in the UAE is this consultation approach, trying to be collaborative. Do either of my colleagues here want to add to this?
I might just qualify that, because one issue, I think, having now covered the region so long, is issues of both corporate governance and transparency. They're going to be addressed in later panels. What I'd love to see in companies, and these are companies coming to the market, companies which are listed, and in banks and non-bank financial institutions, there should be better, far better, non-executive director presence, and from outside the company and outside related parties. And I'd love to see that in my home market in Egypt, see more of it, to help underpin the work being done by EFSA, and to be able to, you see the problem in Tesco in the UK, where there were non-exec directors who were perhaps on multiple boards but didn't know Tesco enough, and that's the problem. You need people who know about finance in those committees and on the boards to try to improve confidence in those institutions to ask the right questions. And I think, and as we can argue outside with, I think it's CCL, talking about the fact that if you've got good people on the boards of whatever it is, any board, and you're helping to improve transparency and accountability, invariably the end result is that that company is better thought of, because you have greater confidence in it and they're able to raise money more easily. So there's a good virtuous circle involved in this that I think is part of making this region compete better, is have better people. And it isn't just the people who are indigenous to the company, it's those people who are advising it, as I said, on the boards too.
Thank you. Faisal, is there anything you'd like to add to this debate on regulation?
Maybe just a simple comment that MENA region is nascent in the sense of breadth and depth of products, activities, human capital, etc. So here the regulation has to come in an evolving way, because at the end of the day, we have growth prospects. You have demographics, young populations, you have economies that are growing in double-digit numbers. If you look at the averages, one of the top growing regions in the world, there's an abundance of liquidities, there's a need for infrastructure spending, so there's a lot of activity that will happen. So there's a need to have regulation promote the business while maintaining a strong grip onto how business is conducted. And maybe just an additional note on the debt capital markets. And there, I think the establishment of yield curves is a necessity. Debt forms an important element, and it still does not feature enough in our markets.
Thank you. I mean, one thing that is happening in the UK, you may know, is that this issue of non-executives has been a major problem since the financial crisis. And there's current regulation proposed where the non-executive directors and the senior managers have actually got to demonstrate accountability and, dare I say it, competence. And the proposal being put out is that non-executive directors and senior managers each year will have to have from their firms effectively a statement of competence, and that satisfies the regulator. And it does follow when our colleagues here were discussing, and Tamir was mentioning about some of the challenges for human capital. It follows, big embarrassment in the UK that so many of the non-executives involved in some of the crashes actually didn't understand the products, particularly the complex derivatives that were funding so much and were being the basis of so many loans. And we've talked about the debt situation and debt as an asset, which is a challenge in itself. But certainly in the UK, next year, those of you that watch what happens in the financial markets will begin to see the non-executive directors and the senior managers having to demonstrate their personal accountability for the competence by which they hold their posts. And we, for example, at the CISI, are very involved with the regulator in developing what we might offer as products to help help in that. Now, I know we've only got 5 minutes left, and thank you. Can I just see if there's a question from the audience? Thank you. Can I have the gentleman, we'll come to you, sir, as well. We'll have both questions. The gentleman there, thank you. If it's in Arabic, I'll need to put my headphones on. So is it in English or Arabic? Thank you.
Thank you. Faisal spoke about the need to create the depth and breadth. Obviously, that's very relevant. Do you think that a unified GCC currency will do the trick? Because we used to hear a lot about GCC currency to be unified, and then various deadlines were set, and then so far we haven't achieved that. Is there any new deadline set? Because we don't hear much about it. Mike, also, if you allow me 2 questions in one, it will be quicker. My question is with Tamer. You mentioned about the SME, and definitely there is need for it to get some funding. What do you think of the crowdfunding, the new aspect which has come into the market? And already a couple of operators are operating from UAE on this side. But unfortunately, there are no regulations to regulate this crowdfunding. So without that, I think we need to focus on that also. So I'll need to have, I would love to hear from you about the crowdfunding aspect and how, quickly we should put in place the regulations so that it doesn't get out of control, because it's a very sensitive area.
Thank you. Well, we're going to take that question, and if I ask my colleagues to hold on to that, could we just have the question from the gentleman in front as well, so that we can cover both questions in the time remaining. So we've got a question about currency, which I'm going to ask my colleagues to think about, and the other question about SMEs, and we'll just have this third question. Thank you.
I'm glad you're allowing regulators to ask questions.
Exactly. Thank you, sir.
A quick reflection and a question. The reflection is one of the key players are auditors. We're blessed in Egypt as a regulator. We have an autonomous unit for quality assurance for the audit industry, which is very important because it keeps auditors on their toes. Not all auditors are Big Four. So it's very important for the whole process. And I think this is something a pan-Arab body should exist to upgrade the industry. And maybe we have certified Arab auditors that can, if they meet certain qualifications, then, they can perform their work in more than one country. Europe has it. Egyptian auditors are allowed to operate in Europe because of us having this unit.
Yeah.
That's the reflection.
Thank you.
The question is, one of my hopes is to have auditor rotations in companies. Angus Blair does research. He operated in Egypt. He knows after a few years, they become very friendly with the CEO and the key shareholders. Should we adopt a 5-year rotation, 6-year rotation? Right. It's mandated in banks in Egypt by the central bank, just for banks. And I think it's very healthy, because when you get a fresh pair of eyes, you can't be, forgetting the same details or too friendly if after 3 or 4 years somebody else will come and look. Yeah. So I think rotation helps, even the audit committee, because it will bring a fresh look and a fresh perspective to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we just have one of my colleagues on the issue of currency? Thank you.
Just to highlight on the debt side, most GCC currencies are pegged to the dollar or to a basket of currencies that are dominated by the dollar. So having that in place, at least in the GCC region, maybe I'm not talking about the Levant or North Africa, but more on the GCC, you have that zone that allows for people to be comfortable in dealing in multi-currencies, cross borders in the GCC. Where you have the challenges is getting investors to be cross-border. So we've done about 20 bond issuances in Kuwait since 2001. Only in the first 2 did we have investors coming in from UAE, Saudi, and Qatar, and then we had basically covering the issuances in Kuwait. Now, what we see is that once you have more synergy in regulation between the GCC countries or between the relevant countries of jurisdiction, then you have a comfort zone by investors, by advisors, investment bankers to look at products in a like way. So if the regulation is similar in Saudi and in Kuwait, for example, I might be able to be sending the opportunity to a counterparty in the Saudi market who would look at it and be of a comfort zone that the standard of that paper is the same here or there, basically investment grade or structure-wise. So the need for a single currency, I think there's been a lot of talk about it. I'm not one to be highlighting where that might be moving, but there's more talk about having the markets synergize rather than have the currency being synergetic.
Thank you. Thank you. Would you like to take
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you. The SME. Thank you.
So I think it's a very good question on the crowdfunding side. The platform we're launching, which is called Emerging Circle, is based on crowdfunding to qualified investors initially. And again, the reason is I've been in this country for 16 years operating the capital markets. There has to be an evolution. The platforms, and I know some of these platforms are represented in this room today, that have launched without getting regulated onshore, I think risk chance of losing credibility. We've been in very close contact with both ESCA, with the central bank. I spent an hour and a half yesterday with the central bank on ensuring that we do things by the book. So the way we're looking at crowdfunding is we're raising capital from qualified investors in a compliant manner within the EU regulation with ESCA and the central bank, and we're lending that through a commercial bank in the UAE using under the watchful eyes of the central bank. So we've tied up with the bank, we've gotten a commercial relationship, and the commercial bank liked the product so much that they've actually invested in the equity of the holding company. But we're finalizing matters with the regulators, and hopefully within a few weeks we'll launch a 100% UAE compliant onshore crowdfunding platform that will encourage the right type of investors into the right type of companies.
Very interesting. And can I just ask, on the rotation of auditing, is there something you could add to that, Angus?
I think it's an interesting proposal from EFSA, but what I'd say, it would be difficult for small companies because the cost, because you have to have a GM and pay for that, and that comes at a cost. I think for larger companies, it's a very interesting, try to think of this answer, having, again, I mentioned earlier, I was at Barings and ABN AMRO, both of them, significant problems in the financial markets. I think it should be looked at. And I certainly think auditors have been at fault across the world in not asking enough questions. They've been too complacent. They are also part of the problem. This isn't just a management issue of the institutions themselves. So I think it's a useful addition to the debate and certainly should be followed up. I wasn't actually aware that the banks had to do this in Egypt. It's good, actually, very good. I think for certain companies over a certain size, perhaps it's something that should be looked at. But for small companies, I think it would be too onerous.
Thank you. I'm just going to have one last question, looking over at the organisers' table, because there was a gentleman over here that had a question. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Just a final question. Thank you very much. It's just, gentlemen, if it's just coming. Yeah, thank you. Just this gentleman here, over there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, for sharing the insights. Actually, it's not a question, it's more to confirm what Angus was saying about, let's say, for the need to rethink about the business model of some markets. In the MENA region, we have definitely to differentiate between the GCC and non-GCC countries. And I think there is a need for the capital market to play a key role, let's say, absolutely locally before maybe thinking to be open or to open to any international market. And in this regard, I would like to see if the idea of having stock markets dedicated to SMEs would be a good step, let's say, in this regard, as all of us know what is the importance of SMEs, especially for some countries in the region. All the governments in the region are looking for let's say, to have a sustainable, inclusive growth, and they are relying, let's say, on the SME market to grow and to grow very rapidly. I have in my mind a very surprising figure, let's say, announced by IFC and the World Bank, which is the lack of financing for SMEs in the region, which is $180 billion. So this is a very huge, let's say, for our region, especially for this type this segment, let's say, of the industry. And you know, I mean, all of us know that even in our countries, SMEs represent more than 80, somehow 90%, let's say, of the economic sector, and they are definitely a very, flourishing, I would say, segment that needs to be attracted by capital markets. So I would like to hear the views on that, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think in our session, I think what has come through from the session this morning is both your concern with regulation and with human capital, which I hope we've covered, but also things like the role of SMEs and the detailed concrete actions that need to be taken within firms as well as by regulators in order to really ensure that the region is as competitive as possible. I'd like to thank my colleagues who have joined me on the panel this morning, and so Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure we'll all be staying longer today if you'd like to ask us any further questions, and thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
I would like to thank our panelists and moderator for their insightful and interesting comments.